As we come to the next topic, I think it's important for me to kind of recognize for everyone watching that I'm aware of my own bias. I'm a pastor at a Protestant evangelical church. Um, and so that's something that will always dictate my perspective. And whereas I'm really trying in this history class to be as objective as possible, I don't have an intention of keeping my bias or my perspective out of it. My desire would be from a teaching or teacher's perspective to be able to communicate in any way that I can a measure of perspective to the events that have occurred in history. So not just providing what occurred, but also some kind of perspective for those who watch. My goal in being objective, the way that I want to do it, is to try to communicate. Listen, I know there's a bias here, but these are the events that occurred, and then this is my perspective on it. So, as we look at the Catholic Counter-Reformation, before we do, I'd like to go to this passage here in Exodus chapter 14. What's happening there is that the nation of Israel is coming out of Egypt, coming out of slavery. They're going through the wilderness, and they come to this place where they're boxed in. On the right hand, there's rocks. On the left hand, there's rocks. In front of them, there's a Red Sea. And as they come to this place where they're boxed in as a people, they really can't move backwards and forwards. And God had led them there to this point. They were following the pillar of cloud. They were following the pillar of fire to get to this place. And so when they get to that point, they look behind them, and the armies of Pharaoh are all coming after them to try to destroy them, to try to attack them. But even though these superior armies, as it were, with superior weaponry, as it were, are coming after them, the Lord does something incredible. First of all, Moses speaks to the people who are panicking. They are freaking out. And Moses tells them, in verse 13, Exodus chapter 14, Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you. You shall hold your peace." And the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward, but lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. And indeed, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they will follow after them. So I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army and his chariots and his horsemen. And then the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gained honor for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." And then this is the verse and the imagery that I'd like to communicate with you all. Verse 19. "And the angel of God who went before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud went from before them and stood behind them." And so what happened was that pillar that they were following, that was leading them through the wilderness, that brought them to this place, now turns around and goes behind them, so that what was before leading them is now protecting them. And the very thing that was leading them, that was guiding them, that was directing them, that was motivating them to move forward, is now the thing that is bringing confusion to their enemies, and that is stalling their enemies until the Lord can prepare a circumstance in which the people of God can be delivered. So as we look here at the Counter-Reformation, which is the Catholic Counter-Reformation was the Catholic Church's response to the Reformation, I think the first thing that's important for us to note is, why did it take so long? You look at the 1500s, right around there when Martin Luther's nailing the 95 Thesis, late 1490 somethings. And so here in the 1500s, that's taking place. Now it's 1545 before the Council of Trent. There were events, there were circumstances within the Roman Catholic Church that they themselves were crying out for reform. They were recognizing that the corruptions that they saw in the papal office, the corruptions that they saw going on in the world around them, in the church around them, required somebody to do something. And they had tried to with the conciliar movement. They had tried to have councils, but then there was arguments about, who can call a council, where should the council be held. They had tried to have a council, and then they brought in a new pope, and then the old pope refused to go away. And then you got three popes, all of them claiming to be the head of the church, all of them claiming that the other is an antichrist. A lot of corruption going on within the papal office was taking place. You have a lot of corruption within the clergy of the church. The priests were selling offices. They were leaving offices intentionally vacant so that they could get more money out of it. They were putting their illegitimate children to have church offices just to keep it in the family, to control more. There was the arguments that were taking place between the papal office and the emperor. So all this stuff is taking place. They recognize that there's corruptions, but why did it take so long for there to be a response? The Protestant Reformation by that point was sweeping across Europe. Entire nations were, and their leaders were turning towards the Protestant faith and be willing to fight for it, And so one of the things is initially when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Thesis to the door at Wittenberg, the castle at Wittenberg, the Pope at the time was Pope Leo X. He was a very Renaissance Pope, a classic Renaissance Pope. So he loved art, he loved gambling, he was very entrenched in political intrigues and trying to navigate through those waters. When this first happened, his response to Martin Luther is, he's a drunken German monk. He'll think differently when he's sober. His second response was, he's a very intelligent monk. But this is an argument between the monastic orders. So that kind of gives you an idea of how he viewed it when it initially came in. But as time went on and it had more and more of an influence on the nation, on the entire continent of Europe, he was forced to have more of a response to it. But I want to take a little bit of a view now of what was going on within the Roman Catholic Church at that time. So you guys are already aware of the conciliar movement, or it's the attempt of the Catholic Church to reform the corruptions from within it by having a church council, and that was not really working. So then there was also another attempt. They had formed a group of people called the Oratory of Divine Love, and it was run by a man called Gasparo Contrarini. Sorry for my poor Italian pronunciation, and I'm probably going to mispronounce a bunch of other foreign names. So I can maybe manage Spanish, but the rest of them I have no guarantees on. Gasparo Contrarini. And it was formed, this group of 50 influential aristocratic Roman Italians. They were formed in order to try to bring the reformations that the church saw was necessary for itself. That's what their response was. Let's get these guys in here. And these guys were, Contrarini was a papal delegate. He was a very, very influential, very powerful man. His initial attempt was to try to reconcile with the Protestants, but that really did not go well. They tried to present a compromised compromised version of the Protestant doctrines, and Luther would have nothing of it. So then you had this group of people. They were never more than 50 members. They were very influential, and they were within the Roman Catholic Church, focused on reforming the corruptions within it. Famous or well-known members of the Oratory of Divine Love were Sadoleto, who debated Calvin, Reginald Pole, and Pietro Carafa, who became Pope Paul IV. So now jumping over to Spain in 1474. So this is, pre-Martin Luther. He was alive, but he hadn't nailed the 95 Thesis there and kind of started this whole thing. But Queen Isabella became queen of Spain, and she was very much passionate about Reformation within the Roman Catholic Church. The cardinal that was there in Spain, Francisco Jimenez, the Archbishop of Toledo, was working with her to try to revitalize and reform Catholicism in Spain. They began to cleanse out the immorality that they saw in the monasteries and convents, requiring them to renew their monastic vows, enforcing poverty for the clergy, and emphasizing education. The Pope gave Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand the authority to use the Inquisition to enforce compliance with church doctrines and practices. And so they mandated that all Jews would convert to Christianity or leave Spain. So this resulted in a lot of Jewish people leaving Spain at that time because they didn't want to convert to Christianity. A lot of Jews converted to Christianity in name, just to be able to stay there. And they also enacted a lot of really harsh laws against the Muslim Moors that were there. Jimenez became the Grand Inquisitor, and there was a lot of persecution and hurt that took place in the name of Christ. But I don't feel the need to try to defend or justify it. I think it was Augustine that said a religion should never be judged by its abuses, it was done in the name of Christ, but it was most certainly not done in the spirit of Christ, and it is nowhere found in Scripture. That never should have been done in the first place. So it was a horrible thing, and it shouldn't have taken place. But it was initially started as an attempt at Reformation in Spain. When you look at the impact that the Reformation had on Germany and those nations around it in Europe, and you look at Spain and you barely see an impact or an influence there, that is in part because of the terror that was instituted in the Grand Inquisition there in Spain, the Spanish Inquisition. It was really effective at kind of, through fear and terror, kind of stopping anything from starting there and in certain parts of France. And then you wonder, well, why did the Reformation not have more of an impact? Well, because the Inquisition was taking place. And so you have these pre-Council of Trent attempts to Catholic Reformation. You've got the conciliar movement we talked about. You have the Oratory of Divine Love, which we talked about, and it's going to be mentioned again in a little bit. You have the Spanish Reformation, was an attempt at Reformation within the Roman Catholic Church. But why did it take so long for all of the Catholic Church to kind of come to a consensus about what their response was going to be to the Protestant movement? Well, there was a couple of reasons for that. One of the reasons for that was Charles V, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and his conflicts with the Pope at the time is one of the reasons for that. As the Protestant movement was sweeping across Europe, the Roman Catholic Church stalled in its overtures towards internal reform. Charles V and the Pope, first they had to agree on whether or not to have a council, because only the Pope was allowed to call a council. Then they had to agree about where to have a council. And so here you have 20, 30 years in which Charles and the other emperors and argued about when and where to have a council, and then who to invite to it, what would be discussed. All those things were kind of argued about back and forth. Charles V struggled with the Pope so far that at a certain point in 1527, he ordered his troops to invade Rome. And after his generals, the leadership of the army that he sent into Rome, when they were killed in battle, the mercenaries that he had hired began to pillage Rome for days on days and days. It was actually weeks that they were there. The Pope hid in the castle of Saint Angelo, but when he was captured, he was imprisoned for about half a year and humiliated. The Pope during Luther's Reformation was Leo X. We discussed that. There were three very reform-minded popes after Leo X. Leo X was not really concerned with Reformation, but there were three that came after him. One was Clement VII, Pope Paul III, and Paul VI. And so Clement VII was the Pope when Charles sent his armies into Rome. It's an interesting thing because Pope Clement VII was the Pope during the time in which Henry VIII was seeking annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. So here you have Catherine of Aragon. She is married to Henry VIII. He wants not to be divorced from her because the Catholic Church would not allow that, but to annul the marriage. Now, when he sends the request for annulment to Pope Clement VII, he is actually in Rome, and the armies of Charles V have surrounded him. And Catherine of Aragon was related to Charles V. So you got to picture the incredibly complex situation that Clement VII is in. Here the King of England wants to have his marriage annulled to the relative of the guy that has his armies all outside of my castle, besieging it. So he was in no place to give permission for the annulment. And then the fact that he sends back to Henry VIII that the annulment was not allowed triggers the English Reformation when they break off from the Roman Catholic Church. And so all these things kind of working together in such a way that it creates a world that secures the movement of what's taking place within the Reformation. So that's Clement VII. Then you have Paul III, Paul VI. Pope Paul III in 1537. Pope Paul III had 4 children. Okay, but when Rome was sacked, he got serious about the changes that he needed to take place within the Roman Catholic Church. He started, so here Rome is besieged, and that kind of slaps some sense into the reality of the situation of the church into him. And he, the first thing he does is he appoints cardinals to the Council of Cardinals, the College of Cardinals. I'm sorry. He appoints cardinals into the College of Cardinals from the Oratory of Divine Love. Remember that group we talked about earlier that was reform-minded? He took some of them and put them into the College of Cardinals. And so that gave them a great deal of influence and power. In 1537, he also had them do, when he put them in the College of Cardinals, he had them do a study, like, how shall I put this? He had them do a study of the church to find out why this was taking place, what's wrong, how do we solve the corruptions that we see within the church? So he had them do kind of a study on this, and they published their study in 1537. The commission issued an official report called Advice Concerning the Reform of the Church. And it said that the disorder within the church could be directly related to the fact that the papal office was too worldly, that both popes and cardinals needed to give more attention to spiritual matters, to stop flirting with secular pursuits. Again, this is taking place after the Reformation within the Roman Catholic Church, things that they recognized within themselves. They said there was bribery in high places, the abuse of indulgences, the evasion of church law among the clergy, and the incredible proliferation of prostitution in Rome. They said this is the reason why the church is in disorder. The Roman church is within disorder. And so another reason why the council that kind of was the response to the Protestant movement took so long to take place is that Charles V not only had a struggle with the Pope, he also had a struggle with the King of France. And so once Pope Paul III finally agreed on having a council, it still was stalled for about 5 years because the King of France saw the attempt at a council as a way in which Charles V would garnish more power and authority for himself. So then now the King of France was trying to stall the council, trying to delay it, try to create all this kind of confusion to try to stall it for as long as possible. So it took several years for the council to take place because of King Francis I of France. There was 2 wars that took place that he did to try to distract from having this council, and then he also incited the Turks against Charles V. The council at Trent finally took place in 1545, 30 years after the 95 Thesis. So again, you can look at this from a lot of different perspectives, but from the perspective in which I look at it, it kind of really feels like the Lord created a little bubble in which the Protestant Reformation was allowed to grow and to dig forth deep roots in order to be established, because God was protecting the freedom of salvation and grace, the priority of God's word over the word of man. God was really allowing that to establish itself. So other things that Pope Paul III did in order to try to revitalize the Catholic Church, he issued that study. He also had the Inquisition started again, the Roman Inquisition. He also created a list of prohibited books, which were books that if you read them as a part of the Catholic Church, they believed if you read them, you risked damnation. That list was updated and kept until 1959. So that list has been around for a really long time. It included all the books by the Protestants. And so these are some of the things that he did. Now I'm gonna, if you allow me, I'd like to press pause on this, what's taking place in France, and the Council of Trent is about to take place. And let's go back. So the Council of Trent took place in 1545. Let's go back to 1521, and I want to introduce you to somebody. Okay, so there was a Spanish nobleman who was fighting in the Emperor's army against the French. Remember, we're talking about the conflict between the Emperor and France. And as this Spanish nobleman is fighting there, a cannonball shatters his leg. And while he's recuperating and he's bored to tears, he decides to read two books. One of them is on the lives of the saints, and the other book is on the life of Christ. By the time he recuperated, Ignatius Loyola left the military, and he joined the Benedictine Abbey of Montserrat. And so while he's there, he was begging door to door. He wore a barbed girdle, fasted for days at a time. And he, as he was trying to kind of beat himself or discipline himself into a measure of spirituality, he came into a long, dark depression. And as he's there in this long, dark depression with suicidal thoughts, there came a point where he had this, what he referred to in himself as an epiphany or a breakthrough, or waves of ecstasy kind of engulfed him, and he said he became another man. So he came to the conclusion through that man had the power to choose between God and Satan, between good and evil. So you look at now Martin Luther, you contrast him with Ignatius Loyola, and Martin Luther came to the conclusion through his challenges and struggles, man, I really can't do anything. It has to be the divine supernatural work of God through faith and grace in Christ. And then Ignatius Loyola came to the exact opposite conclusion. He said, you really can work hard enough to attain a measure of spirituality, and it has to be by the strength of your will. And I can teach you how to discipline your will and to be able to use that strength of will to choose what's good and to become a godly, righteous person. This was the doctrine, the mindset of Ignatius Loyola. And so he proceeds from that to write a spiritual military manual. See, this guy was a soldier. He comes out of it with still a soldier's mindset. And he wants, and not that there's anything wrong with that. We should, we're called to be soldiers, but the way in which he was exercising discipline to kind of build up his own godliness and to encourage other people to build up their godliness through discipline and through a military-like loyalty to the Pope. He writes this military manual, and you read through it, and his exercises are just like, imagine how painful hell feels. Feel the fire, smell the sulfur, hear the screams, and so these are the things that you would kind of meditate on if you were a part of the group of followers that he developed, in order to strengthen your will to be able to choose between doing what's right and what's wrong, becoming a more righteous person. So he emphasized these exercises, and then he also emphasized loyalty to the Pope. So you think about it along the lines of, as a military Spanish nobleman, he had the loyalty to his lord, that he would fight for them and die for them. And he said, no, well, now in the Catholic Church, let's take that loyalty and let's exercise that loyalty towards the Pope. And they vowed to the Pope that they would go anywhere he would send them, whether it was to the Germans, to Luther, the Lutherans in Germany, or whether it was to go to Japan, or whether it was to go to Brazil. By the time he was dead, his little group of people, his order, his monastic order that he started, had reached to all those places, to Japan, to Brazil, to Germany. And his monastic order that he started became the military arm of the papacy. They called themselves the School of Christ, or the Followers of Christ, or you might have heard of them and be familiar with them as the Jesuits. Okay, so they went to Pope Paul III, and they requested that this Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, would become a new monastic order, and Pope Paul III approved it in 1540. So by the time the council directed towards the Reformation of the Catholic Church in the Council of Trent, these military monastic arms of the Pope were equipped and ready to battle. So the Jesuit order, the Jesuits, were militant. They were militant. They were, and I would say, as an evangelical, very works-based. They were very disciplined. They were very educationally minded. They had reached as far as Japan, Brazil, Ethiopia, and every country in Europe. And very much the mindset of the Jesuit order was that the ends justify the means. As long as what we're aiming to accomplish is good, then we can accomplish it by whatever means necessary. So that brings us now to, they're necessary. You got to understand that they were very much present and responsible for the way things went in the Council of Trent. So the Council of Trent was convened in 1545. The Protestants were allowed to attend, but they were not allowed to have a voice in it. And basically, the Council of Trent was the Roman Catholic Church's response. They were saying, listen, we got to fix some things in the church, and we know it, but we'll fix it ourselves. We don't want the Protestants to dictate to us how we do it. And so it was called together by Pope Paul III. They wanted to reform on their own terms. And so here were some of the things that were established at the Council of Trent: salvation by faith and works, transubstantiation. They doubled down basically on these doctrines. They instead of changing them, they doubled down on them and said, this is definitely a part of what we believe. This is definitely a part of what we want to be our identity. Salvation by faith and works, transubstantiation, the Mass as understood by the medieval church, the 7 sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church, celibacy of the clergy, the doctrine of indulgences, they doubled down on it, and the existence of purgatory. So when this council convened, the Pope left there with more power. He affirmed these doctrines and explicitly pronounced curses on anyone that disagreed. The Protestants were very disappointed. Present at this was Ignatius Loyola, was there for this Council of Trent. And so it was a major power play on behalf of the Roman Catholic Church. It placed them back into a position of power because they kind of united behind these reformations, these reforms that they instituted within the church. It redefined and revitalized their own identity. And so they kind of backed behind those things. And then right after this Council of Trent in 1545, which, by the way, it took place between 1545 and 1563. First, they met from 1545 to 1547. Then they met from 1551 to 1552. Then they met again from 1562 to 1563. And so right after the Council of Trent, this long council that took place, and they redefined their identity, the world was kind of thrown into havoc in the 30 Years' War, which took place from 1618 to 1648. And basically what was taking place in the 30 Years' War was that all the nations now by this time, the Protestant movement, the Reformation movement had defined itself. It had established roots. It knew who it was, and it knew what it was fighting for. And now the Roman Catholic Church also had redefined itself, knew its identity, had decided what its identity was going to be, and they were prepared to fight for it. So now the nation states that had been established at this point, with kings and leadership, depending upon where they had sworn their loyalty, began to fight amongst themselves to redraw the boundaries of Europe and the nations that were taking place there, that were really growing there. Where are the lines going to be drawn religiously speaking? Is this European continent going to be a Protestant? Is it going to be Catholic? And so they're all fighting amongst themselves. So you've got to picture the Protestant kings fighting against the Catholic kings fighting against the Protestant kings, and it turns out into this incredibly bloody war. The 30 Years' War was this violent, bloody, gory thing that took place. By some estimates, they would say that 30% of the German population was killed in the war, or because of the famine and the pestilence that followed it. Even by conservative estimates, some say that might be a little exaggerated, but by conservative estimates, very likely 15 to 20% of the entire population of Germany suffered death due to this violent war. It had four major periods: the Bohemian Revolt from 1618 to 1625, the Danish intervention from 1625 to 1629, the Swedish intervention from 1630 to 1635, and the Swedish-French intervention from 1635 to 1648. So these four major periods, and by the end of it, so much death, so much famine, pestilence, resulting from it. By the end of it, it ended in a stalemate. The lines were drawn in almost exactly the same places that they were drawn before. And, thanks in part to the efforts of a Swedish general called Gustav Adolphus of Sweden. If it weren't for his efforts in the battles that he fought, Europe would have been overtaken by Catholicism. But he was a brilliant military man, and people thought very highly of him. Even Napoleon studied the way that he fought battle because of how good he was at strategy. And so the 30 Years' War ended was ended by the Peace of Westphalia, which was a treaty that was signed in Munster, of all places. And then Europe, at this point, which was kind of expressed in the Peace of Westphalia, Europe was sick of religious conflict. They were done. They were not going to have any more religious wars in Europe for a very long time. It ended the age of mercenary armies in Europe, and it started the age of nations. It officially started the age of nations fielding their own disciplined armies that were just kept there, these national armies. So that brings us right about to 1648, and now we're going to, in the next session, we're going to look at how Christianity went into a more modern world, and hopefully take a little look at the Reformation in England.